Where am I? God.
Commander Calloway, we're picking up your beacon. Hold on, we're coming for you.
I can't let them leave here.
Commander Reese Calloway clenched his jaw as the alarm shrieked inside his helmet. The Artemis 9 lander shuddered violently, its descent disrupted by something wrong beneath the surface. His hands flew over the controls, recalibrating thrust, but it was too late. The crater had collapsed beneath him. One moment, his feet hovered just above the lunar surface. The next, the rock beneath him cracked like brittle glass, and he was falling. The lander slammed into the void below, a thunderous crunch of metal against stone. The cockpit went dark. Reese was thrown forward, his harness biting into his ribs as the impact rattled through his body. For a few seconds, there was only ringing in his ears, the silence after impact almost worse than the crash itself. Then, pain, a searing, lacerating wrongness in his side. He exhaled sharply, sucking air through his teeth as he forced himself to move. His suit's internal HUD flickered erratically, displaying altitude warnings that no longer mattered. He wasn't on the surface anymore. His fingers felt slick against his ribcage. Blood. The reinforced polyweave of his suit was torn, a jagged piece of metal from the control panel embedded just beneath his ribs. Not fatal. Not yet. He tried to take a breath. A sharp, suffocating pressure coiled around his chest, like a vice. Cracked ribs. He forced himself upright, biting down a groan. The Artemis 9 was done for. The cockpit was crushed inward, the panels flickering dimly as oxygen seeped from a fractured seal. Reese unlatched himself from the chair and staggered forward, bracing against the wreckage. His visor read 16% oxygen remaining. He lifted his head toward the only source of light. A faint glow, almost phosphorescent, pulsed from the cavern walls around him. This wasn't a crater. It was something else. Reese swallowed hard. He activated his comms. Artemis Base, this is Commander Calloway. I've crashed. Unknown subsurface location. Lander compromised. Oxygen low. Nothing. Just static. He glanced up. The opening above him, where the lunar surface had once been, was gone. Collapsed. The rock had sealed itself as if the land had swallowed him whole. Panic threatened to claw at his mind, but he forced it back. Think. If he didn't find an oxygen source, he'd be dead within the hour. His only option was forward, deeper into the tunnels that pulsed with a slow, unsettling glow. The cavern walls were unlike anything he had seen before. Not stone, at least not entirely. The texture was wrong, smooth yet fibrous, with a faint translucence beneath its surface. As Reese moved closer, his suit detected faint heat signatures within the rock, as if something was alive just beneath the surface. He shuddered. Keep moving. His boots crunched over brittle lunar dust, but the farther he ventured, the more the ground changed beneath him. The texture softened, becoming slick, damp. Then a sound. A clicking, sharp, rhythmic, distant at first, but growing closer. Reese froze, his breath hitching. He swung his light in the direction of the noise. The tunnel ahead narrowed, but beyond it, the dim bioluminescence revealed movement. A shape. No, many shapes. They emerged from the dark with an inhuman grace, their elongated limbs folding unnaturally as they moved. Their skin, if it could even be called that, was pale and stretched, almost translucent in the strange glow. Their bodies were thin but impossibly tall, their arms and legs segmented in multiple joints like twisted marionettes. Eyes, milky white and pupilless, turned toward him in unison. The clicking grew louder. Reese's pulse slammed against his ribs. He took a step back. The figures advanced. Instinct roared through his body, run. But before he could turn, something lunged. A long, sinewy limb lashed out with inhuman speed, striking his helmet. His vision exploded in static. His body hit the ground hard, pain lancing through his fractured ribs. More limbs wrapped around him, too many hands pulling, lifting. The world spun as they dragged him, their clicking sounds now a chorus, reverberating through his skull like a sickening melody. His mind screamed for him to fight, but as the bioluminescent tunnels blurred past him, the oxygen in his suit plummeted. 7%, 4%, 2%. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was a massive, undulating chamber ahead, a place that breathed. Then the world faded to black. Reese Calloway awoke to the sensation of something moving against his skin. It was subtle, barely there, but the feeling made his stomach twist in revulsion. His eyelids fluttered, his body sluggish, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The first thing he noticed was the absence of his helmet. Cold air, thin, tinged with an almost metallic taste, whispered across his exposed face. His lungs burned as he inhaled, his chest tightening painfully. The atmosphere here wasn't made for him. It wasn't meant for human survival. The second thing he noticed was the hands. They pressed against him, dozens of them, fingers thin and impossibly long, their touch cold and clammy. Some traced along his arms, his ribs, his throat, pressing curiously as if testing the structure of his body. Others prodded at his side at the jagged tear where metal had punctured him. Reese tried to move. His limbs wouldn't respond. His vision swam, pupils struggling to adjust to the dim, pulsating glow surrounding him. The chamber around him was wrong, its walls shifting ever so slightly, as if something beneath the surface was alive and moving. Strange, vein-like growths pulsed along the walls, glowing faintly with an internal light. Then the figures surrounding him came into focus. The Ikaru. There were hundreds of them. They loomed over him, watching in eerie silence. Their bodies were impossibly tall and spindly, their limbs segmented at unnatural angles. Their skin, pale, stretched thin over sinewy muscles, seemed almost translucent in the bioluminescent glow. But it was their faces that disturbed him the most. No mouths, just smooth, featureless flesh where mouths should be. And their eyes, milky white, pupilless, reflecting nothing but the dim light around them. The clicking sound began again, reverberating through the chamber in a rhythmic, layered cadence. It wasn't random noise, it was communication. Reese gritted his teeth and tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his tongue thick in his mouth. His body wasn't listening to him. One of the Akaru stepped forward, its elongated fingers reaching for his wound. Reese sucked in a sharp breath as a thick, viscous black fluid oozed from the alien's fingertips. It smelled faintly of iron and something rotten. Before he could react, the Akaru pressed the fluid into the gash at his side. A bolt of agony shot through him. His body arched against the surface he was laid upon, a raw, unearthly heat spreading through his flesh. He gasped, vision flickering with white-hot pain. It felt like something was crawling under his skin, twisting into his veins. Then, relief. The pain dulled almost instantly, numbing into an unnatural coolness. His breath evened, the burning sensation in his chest fading. His body sagged against the organic surface beneath him. The Akaru had healed him. But at what cost? Reese's fingers twitched, strength slowly returning to his limbs. He forced himself upright, ignoring the way the Akaru shifted, their clicking sounds intensifying. They were observing him. He glanced down at his side. The wound was gone. No stitches, no scar, just smooth, unblemished skin. But something about it was wrong. He flexed his fingers, then pressed a palm against his ribs. His flesh felt too soft, too elastic. A sick wave of unease rolled through him. His breath quickened. He needed to get out of here. Reese pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. The Akaru did not stop him. They merely watched, their elongated fingers twitching, their blank faces unreadable. His boots made no sound as he took a cautious step forward. The chamber floor was warm, the texture unsettling, like walking on damp muscle. A movement in the walls caught his attention. He turned his head and froze. The walls weren't just pulsating. They were breathing. Something inside them shifted. Shapes, half-formed, moving just beneath the thin membrane of organic material stretched across the cavern walls. Some of the figures were small, curled, and fetal. Others were human-sized. Reese's stomach lurched. His breath came in ragged gasps. He turned back to the Akaru, his voice raw. What is this place?" The clicking intensified. The nearest Akaru stepped forward, tilting its head at an unnatural angle. It raised its hand again, fingers unfurling, gesturing towards something in the distance. Reese followed its gaze. A chamber loomed at the far end of the tunnel, its entrance lined with fleshy, ribbed folds, twitching faintly. Beyond it, inside the dim glow, he could see things. They were not fully formed, limbs stretching, warping, mouths appearing and disappearing in places where mouths should not be. Bones shifting beneath skin that wasn't yet set, muscles moving like liquid. It was a birthplace, but not a natural one. Something was making them, and it had started making him too. Reese took a step back, his breath hitching. His fingers trembled as he touched his ribs again, as if expecting his bones to move beneath his skin. The Akaru did not stop him. They only watched. He understood now. They had saved him, but not for his sake. They had begun to change him. His stomach turned violently. He pressed a shaking hand to his chest, to the unnatural smoothness of his skin. He had to get out. Now. Reese moved as fast as his failing body would allow, his breath ragged in the thin, unnatural air. His boots struck the slick, pulsing ground, each step sending a tremor through his legs. His body still wasn't right, his skin too soft, his bones too pliable. But he pushed forward, forcing himself deeper into the tunnels. The Akaru did not pursue him. They simply watched as he fled, their pale, expressionless faces unreadable, their milky eyes reflecting the dim bioluminescence of the caverns. That terrified him more than anything. They weren't trying to stop him, because they knew he couldn't leave. His mind screamed for oxygen, for solid ground, for the sterile emptiness of space. But all he had was the slow, suffocating thrum of the tunnels around him. They pulsed like veins, the walls shifting as he moved past them, exhaling faint gusts of warm, organic air. Reese didn't care. He couldn't care. He just had to find his ship. The tunnels twisted in directions that shouldn't have been possible, spiraling, dipping, curving back on themselves like a labyrinth made to keep things inside. He didn't stop to think about how deep he had been dragged, how far beneath the lunar surface he was. If he thought about it, if he let himself dwell on the impossible anatomy of this place, he'd freeze. He couldn't freeze. He couldn't become one of them. His ribs ached with every breath, but he ignored it, focusing on the distant glow ahead, the faint red pulse of his emergency beacon. It flickered like a heartbeat, a reminder that he was still human, still alive. He was close. The walls around him grew less organic, the ground solidifying beneath his feet. The pulsating warmth faded, replaced by the familiar texture of cold lunar rock. His heart pounded. There, a glimpse of metal, the wreckage of the Artemis Norm, a half buried in dust and stone. Reese staggered forward, lungs burning. The air was thinner here, closer to the surface. The beacon flashed frantically, detecting his proximity. His ship was still intact. He could make it. Then a sound, a deep, wet groan from the walls behind him. Reese turned, chest heaving. The tunnel behind him was no longer just a tunnel. It was alive. The walls split open like a gaping wound, peeling apart in slick, wet ribbons of flesh. Beneath them, something moved, something vast and writhing, an exposed network of pulsing veins and undulating muscles stretching deep into the cavern's core. And then it emerged, a shifting mass of flesh and limbs, not yet fully formed, not yet fully anything. Mouths appeared and disappeared, some gasping soundlessly, others filled with rows of needle-thin teeth, gnashing together in a wet, grinding motion. Its skin was translucent, revealing bones shifting beneath muscle, its form unstable, as if it hadn't decided what it wanted to be. But Reese knew what it was. It was them. The Akaru. The ones that had failed. The ones that had been reborn wrong. It didn't move like a creature. It moved like a disease, a collection of writhing mutations, all trying to become something complete, but never getting there. It saw him. It wanted him. Reese stumbled back, hands clawing at the ship's airlock panel. His fingers were numb, his skin too soft, bending slightly when he pressed against the controls. He could feel the Akaru's touch lingering in his body, the changes happening too slowly for his mind to fully comprehend. He slammed his palm against the override. The door hissed open. He threw himself inside the ship's sterile interior, feeling like sanctuary after the pulsing rot of the tunnels. The creature screamed, a soundless, gurgling howl, as if it had too many throats and not enough mouths to shape them. The airlock sealed just as it reached him. Reese collapsed against the cold metal floor, gasping, his vision swimming. His hands ached. He looked down at them. His fingertips were translucent. Not entirely, not fully, but enough. The change was still happening. He wasn't safe yet. A tremor rattled the ship. Something was moving outside. Reese forced himself up, limbs shaking as he staggered towards the cockpit. The ship's emergency systems flickered weakly, damaged but functional. He activated long-range communications. The static-filled screen lit up. Then, a voice. "Artemis Base. Repeat. Artemis Base. This is Commander Reese Calloway. I am alive. My ship is compromised, but I have oxygen. I need immediate retrieval. Do you copy?" The delay stretched into eternity. Then a response. "Copy that, Commander Calloway. We're receiving your beacon. Rescue team en route. Hang tight." Reese exhaled sharply, hands trembling. He was going home. Then he heard it, the clicking, faint, right outside the ship. He turned his head slowly, his stomach twisting. The Akaru were waiting. They lined the perimeter of the wreck, watching. Hundreds of them. Their milky, pupilless eyes reflected the weak red glow of the beacon, their spindly limbs shifting in eerie synchronization. They weren't angry. They weren't afraid. They were just waiting. Then Reese understood. His ship's beacon. The signal. He had just given them a way back to Earth. A way home. The radio crackled. "Commander Calloway, ETA 45 minutes. Hold tight." Reese's stomach clenched. He had made a terrible mistake. Reese Calloway stood in the dim glow of the cockpit, his fingers trembling against the flickering control panel. The voice on the radio repeated itself, steady, calm, oblivious. "Commander Calloway, rescue is en route. ETA 45 minutes. Do you copy?" He could barely hear it over the sound of his own pulse thudding in his ears. His body ached, his skin felt wrong, his very bones softening, reforming beneath his flesh. The Akaru's gift, or their curse, was still working its way through him, changing him from the inside out. But that wasn't what terrified him the most. Outside the ship, they were waiting. Hundreds of them, standing perfectly still in the dust, their elongated bodies casting skeletal shadows beneath the weak glow of the emergency beacon. Their featureless faces were turned toward the ship, toward him, as if they could already see what he was becoming. But they weren't watching him. They were watching the sky, waiting. The beacon pulsed, sending a signal into the black void above, the signal that had doomed everything. Reese staggered back from the console, a ragged breath shuddering from his chest. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. But it was. His desperate call for rescue had given them exactly what they wanted. A way home. The Akaru had been trapped here for 1,000 years, forgotten, left to rot in the cold, endless dark of the moon. Now he had opened the door for them. The realization settled into his gut like a dying star. He turned back to the screen, staring at the rescue team's incoming coordinates. The ship would be here soon, and when it arrived, they would take more than just him back to Earth. His breath hitched. He could not let that happen. He moved without thinking, hands flying across the console, tearing through the ship's remaining systems. Emergency override, manual control. Shut it down, shut it all down. The beacon was locked in transmission. He cursed under his breath, chest heaving. There was only one way to stop it now. The ship had to be destroyed. His fingers hovered over the emergency core rupture command. If he activated it, the ship's power source would destabilize. There would be no explosion, no fire in the vacuum of space. But the energy surge would collapse the surrounding tunnels, obliterating everything caught inside, including him, including them. A tremor rolled through his fingers. His body was shaking, his mind screaming at him to stop, to wait. 45 minutes until he was home. He swallowed, his throat tight. Home. Could he even call it that anymore? He looked down at his hands, at the subtle translucence creeping through his fingers, the veins beneath his skin too dark, too thick, shifting when he moved. How much of him was still human? Would they even recognize him when he returned? Would he recognize himself? Or would Earth just become a new place for the Akaru to spread? His breath hitched. He already knew the answer. Reese closed his eyes and pressed the command. A deep, guttural groan rippled through the ship. Warning lights flared red across the panels, alarms blaring in his ears. The systems began to collapse. Core breach imminent. The rescue team would never reach him now, and neither would the Akaru. Outside the ship, they began to move, sensing the shift. Some turned, heads tilting in eerie unison. Others stepped forward, their elongated limbs unfolding, inching toward the hull, toward him. Reese exhaled and laughed. A broken, breathless sound, raw in the silent void. The walls of the cavern shuddered, the living tunnels twitching, convulsing as the ship's core ruptured. He felt the energy surge beneath his feet, felt the moon itself begin to cave in. The Akaru screamed, not in pain, in rage, their blank faces twisted, their mouths forming, finally forming, only to shriek as the ground beneath them collapsed. Reese staggered as the ship buckled, his body failing, his vision swimming. He barely felt it when his legs gave out, when his bones shifted too easily, when his skin, his changing skin, began to crack beneath the pressure. He fell. The last thing he saw before the world disappeared was the Akaru reaching for him, their fingers stretching, bending, pulling. Then nothing. A silence so complete it swallowed everything. Earth never found the wreckage of the Artemis 9. Reese Calloway was declared lost, another casualty of space. The moon remained silent, and beneath its cold, barren surface, the last remnants of the Akaru lay entombed, waiting, but not forever.